Hello, everyone. This is going to be the last in the series of introductory lectures before I actually start diving into the Spake Zarathustra itself. So this, as the last episode, it's going to be another rather miscellaneous episode. There's just a number of ideas that I want to cover or give some perspectives on, and so it's definitely going to seem kind of miscellaneous. It may start to actually resemble Nietzsche's own writing itself in a way, in the sense that I've organized it into a series of separate sections that may not initially appear to have a close relationship to each other, but they are meant to be read, or in this case, listened to together. And to start us off, I have two things which I have not written. They are two poems that I recently read, and I was very, very struck by them, and I just feel like they would do very nicely as an introduction, or in light of everything that we've talked about with Nietzsche. I think you'll be able to see some of the interesting connections or contrasts with Nietzsche's own point of view. So the first of those poems is by Letitia Elizabeth Landon, called Lines of Life, written in 1829. Well read my cheek and watch my eye, too strictly schooled are they, one secret of my soul to show, one hidden thought betray. I never knew the time my heart looked freely from my brow. It once was checked by timidness, 'tis taught by caution now. I live among the cold, the false, and I must seem like them. And such I am, for I am false, as those I most condemn. I teach my lip its sweetest smile, my tongue its softest tone. I borrow others' likeness till almost I lose my own. I pass through flattery's gilded sieve, whatever I would say. In social life all, like the blind, must learn to feel their way. I check my thoughts like curbed steeds that struggle with the rain. I bid my feelings sleep like wrecks in the unfathomed main. I hear them speak of love, the deep, the true, and mock the name, mock at all high and early truth, and I, too, do the same. I hear them tell some touching tale, I swallow down the tear. I hear them name some generous deed, and I have learnt to sneer. I hear the spiritual, the kind, the pure, but named in mirth, till all of good, aye, even hope, seems exiled from our earth. And one fear, withering ridicule, is all that I can dread, a sword hung by a single hair forever o'er the head. We bow to a most servile faith in a most servile fear, while none among us dares to say what none will choose to hear. And if we dream of loftier thoughts, in weakness they are gone, and indolence and vanity rivet our fetters on. Surely I was not born for this. I feel a loftier mood, of generous impulse, high resolve, steal o'er my solitude. I gaze upon the thousand stars that fill the midnight sky, and wish, so passionately wish, a light like theirs on high. I have such eagerness of hope to benefit my kind, and feel as if immortal power were given to my mind. I think on that eternal fame, the sun of earthly gloom, which makes the gloriousness of death the future of the tomb, that earthly future the faint sign of a more heavenly one, a step, a word, a voice, a look. Alas, my dream is done. And earth's debasing stain again is on my soul, and I am but a nameless part of a most worthless whole. Why write I this? Because my heart towards the future springs, that future where it loves to soar on more than eagle wings. The present it is but a speck in that eternal time in which my lost hopes find a home, my spirit knows its clime. Oh, not myself, for what am I, the worthless and the weak, whose every thought of self should raise a blush to burn my cheek? But song has touched my lips with fire, and made my heart a shrine for what, although alloyed, debased, is in itself divine. I am myself but a vile link amid life's weary chain, but I have spoken hallowed words, oh, do not say in vain. My first, my last, my only wish, say, will my charmed chords wake to the morning light of fame and breathe again my words? Will the young maiden, when her tears alone in moonlight shine, tears for the absent and the loved, murmur some song of mine? Will the pale youth by his dim lamp, himself a dying flame, from many an antique scroll beside, choose that which bears my name? Let music make less terrible the silence of the dead. I care not, so my spirit last long after life has fled. The second poem is by James Leigh Hunt, called Abu Ben Adhem, written in 1834. Abu Ben Adhem, may his tribe increase, awoke one night from a deep dream of peace, and saw, within the moonlight in his room, making it rich and like a lily in bloom, an angel writing in a book of gold. Exceeding peace had made Ben Adhem bold, and to the presence in the room he said, What writest thou? The vision raised its head, and with a look made all of sweet accord answered, The names of those who love the Lord. And is mine one? Said Abu. Nay, not so, replied the angel. Abu spoke more low, but cheerly still, and said, I pray thee, then, write me as one who loves his fellow men. The angel wrote and vanished. The next night it came again, with a great wakening light, and showed the names whom love of God had blessed, and lo, Ben Adhem's name led all the rest. When it comes to matters of the heart, some people are more like mice, and some people are more like elephants. The tiny mouse scurries about on the forest floor, weaving through labyrinthian roots and rocks, exploring every nook and cranny to see who or what is there. The mouse is nimble and precise, and is more intimately familiar with the minute differences between, say, this root and that root, this rock and that rock, this flower and that flower. Everything is intimate for the mouse, and it takes the mouse a very long time to explore and become familiar with a single tree, a single rock, a single little patch of forest floor. Meanwhile, the elephant is too big to worry about such details and individual differences. The elephant generalizes. It cannot explore every nook. In fact, it does not care about every nook. With every step it passes over 100 such nooks. This does not matter, since from the elephant's perspective they are not individual nooks, but a pattern of more or less identical pockmarks in the ground. Certainly there are differences between these pockmarks, but for the elephant those differences hardly matter. What matters is that they are all pockmarks. The same goes for leaves, for roots, for trees. The elephant's size forces it to generalize rather than to specify. We might imagine a conversation between these two animals. "Ho there!" squeaks the mouse to the elephant. "What do you think you're doing?" The elephant was in fact in the process of arranging some fallen tree branches into a kind of little hut or teepee. "Good morrow, little mouse," the elephant replied. "I am doing a public service. I am building shelters for the mice like you." The mouse looked around and saw that this was true. The elephant had constructed a dozen or so nearly identical little teepees out of leafy branches. The mouse was flabbergasted. "What on earth do you mean? All of these teepees are the same." "Of course," the elephant replied. "I don't know for sure who will be living in them, so I made them as generic as possible. They are all approximately the right size for a mouse and should keep them safe from the rain." "Oh, foolish elephant," the mouse cried. "Don't you know that all mice are not the same? Maybe one or two will find your teepees perfectly comfortable, but the rest will not be happy in them." "I do not understand," the elephant replied. "I have looked at your mice dwellings before, and they are all basically the same. So I have simply used a generic version, an average, if you will. I thought that would be fair." "Oh, foolish elephant," the mouse cried again. "You cannot see the individual differences that I see. You would have us mice all become the same. You would erase our differences and make us clones of the same mouse. You care not for the individual mouse. You only love an abstract, ideal mouse, a mouse that does not actually exist."
"Now hold on," the elephant protested. "I think you're overstating the case. You mice are simply not that different. In fact, if I may be frank, the mice who were the most different from the other mice I saw seemed also, to me, to be the most unhealthy, the most unhappy, the most deviant. It seems to me that those mice would do well if they would just let go of their idiosyncrasies, which isolate them from the mouse commonweal, and return to the fold, and learn how to compromise and harmonize with their brethren."
But at this point, the mouse cried out, "I can't believe what I am hearing. You would stamp out diversity. You would make us all the same mouse."
"Well, yes," the elephant said, "if that mouse is the best mouse. Don't you want to be the best, happiest mouse? Don't you want your mouse brethren to all become the best, happiest mice? To achieve the most optimal mouse experience?"
"What on earth do you mean?" the mouse replied. "Who made you the expert on mouse happiness and felicity?"
"Fair enough," the elephant said. "Fair enough. Teach me what makes a mouse happiest, and I will build the ideal shelter for that mouse."
"No, no," the mouse said.
"Why not?" the elephant replied. "Do you deny that there is such a thing as a happiest mouse?"
"Well," the mouse began, "if you were talking, say, to the ENFP or the INFP mouse, then that might be the case. But you are talking to the INTJ gamma mouse, and my problem is different. I believe there can be, as it were, a happiest mouse, but I deny that every type of mouse is destined for that highest happiness."
"What?" the elephant cried, flabbergasted himself. "You believe some mice are just more capable of happiness than others? You condemn some of your mice brethren to a less happy existence?"
"Listen," the mouse said, "if you have a dozen or so goblets of various shapes and sizes, you can fill each of those goblets to the brim. In that sense, I suppose they are equally happy or fulfilled. But don't tell me that they each have the same amount of liquid in them. Don't tell me that filling a mouse goblet is the same as filling an elephant goblet. Some goblets are bigger than others. That's just the way it is. The bigger goblets are more capable of unhappiness too, mind you. That is their burden. They are destined for greatness, but under threat of catastrophe. The smaller goblets should be grateful.
they do not have that burden.
And do elephants have a larger goblet than mice do?
Don't be ridiculous. That would be a false analogy. And anyway, I'm not a speciesist. I'm sure there are elephants with just as big a goblet as mine.
The elephant said, I still fear there may be some very unpleasant ramifications from that doctrine, even just among you mice. Couldn't one argue that certain types of mice are smaller goblets than others, and so they are unsuited for certain occupations? And couldn't that lead to you saying, well, all know that mice with black spots are less capable of happiness than mice with white spots? Leave the black-spotted mice to their lesser happiness. This is a white-spotted mouse's burden.
Such mice would be absolute, intolerable fools. What do spots have to do with it? Test each mouse individually, spots or not, and see what it can do. You see, the trouble with you, elephant, is that you are always trying to generalize. You are always saying all the mice with black spots must be the same. You're trying to mechanize everything and deal with mouse populations instead of actual mice.
The elephant said, and I suppose that you are one of the big goblets?
Of course, the mouse replied, but that doesn't make me wrong.
Imagine a poor farmer family. They have 6 children. The youngest child, they all soon realize, is a bit brighter than the rest. He soon reads through all the books in the house, teaches himself basic mathematics, and dreams of being a great philosopher. The family decides it must do something, so the family begins pooling its resources. Everyone chips in most of their earnings in order to generate a surplus. And once this surplus matures, they use it to send the child off to university to develop his talents and make a name for himself. The family members accept their fate to remain on the farm so that one of their number could reach a higher place. And the family members were not envious or gloomy about this, though they had condemned themselves to mediocrity. Rather, they rejoiced in their younger brother, and in fact, with every letter he sent back home, they felt that they were participating vicariously in his success. What could be more insidious than a serpent sneaking into this family's garden and whispering in each ear, "But why does only he get to go to college? Why is he the chosen one and not you? Isn't that unfair? Isn't that unjust? Do you not have a right to say, if I can't triumph, no one can?" In the first book of Samuel, from the Old Testament in the Bible, the nation of Israel, which heretofore was ruled by judges, demands the coronation of a king over them. The prophet Samuel warns them that having a king will lead to tyranny and oppression, and yet they still demand a king. Why? One reason may be so that they could vicariously experience the power of being a king. It is not unheard of for nations to forge their own chains, the chains which will bind later generations, because they misidentified themselves with the overlords they put into power. For when Israel cried out for a king, they were really crying out for their own coronation, with the king as their proxy. We do the same thing with celebrities and with movie characters. Perhaps that is the very purpose of celebrities. For readers in the United States, the word slavery really touches a nerve. It has a concrete relevance. There is not enough historical distance between us and it for it to be mythologized.
Most importantly, for Americans, slavery is implicitly racial. But historically, slaves were most often just the bottom rung of a given socioeconomic ladder. Anyone could, in theory, become a slave as a result of unpaid debts, military conquest, or terrible misfortune. All ancient civilizations up into the Christian era were built upon slave labor, and Paul the Apostle makes abundant use of slave imagery, even calling himself a slave of Christ. By the 1220s AD, the territories comprising modern Germany were already outlawing slavery on theological grounds, so that by Nietzsche's time, the practice had been extinct for several centuries. There was, for all intents and purposes, slavery in the German colonies in Africa, but those colonies were only being set up while Nietzsche was writing in the late 1800s, and their official policy was anti-slavery, though in practice this was untrue. Slavery did not and could not have the same connotation for Nietzsche or for his contemporaries as it does for many of us today. They had the luxury of naivete. Furthermore, Nietzsche was a classicist and knew of slavery primarily through the lens of the literate Romans and Greeks, for whom it was as inevitable as unemployment and homelessness are for us. The only reason I mention any of that is to help explain how it is that Nietzsche can seem so casual with his own use of the word slave. In fact, his meaning by the word slave is unexpectedly esoteric. This is a general principle when reading Nietzsche, especially his published works. In section 40 of Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, quote, "Whatever is profound loves masks. What is most profound even hates image and parable." This is a paraphrase of that same phrase, but just to make it a little more clear what Nietzsche is saying. Whatever is deep loves to disguise itself, and that which is deepest does not even like any indication or through line whatsoever to its true nature. To continue Nietzsche's quote, "There are occurrences of such a delicate nature that one does well to cover them up with some rudeness to conceal them. There are actions of love and extravagant generosity after which nothing is more advisable than to take a stick and give any eyewitness a sound thrashing that would muddle his memory. It is not the worst things that cause the worst shame. There is not only guile behind a mask, there is so much graciousness in cunning. I could imagine that a human being who had to guard something precious and vulnerable might roll through life rude and round as an old green wine cask with heavy hoops. The refinement of his shame would want it that way. Every profound spirit needs a mask. Even more, around every profound spirit a mask is growing continually, owing to the constantly false, namely shallow, interpretation of every word, every step, every sign of life he gives." Unquote. There is so much to unpack even from that one quotation, but for now suffice it to say that Nietzsche was quite happy to seem outrageous, immoral, and to say things in such a way that a casual reader would retort, "That is abominable. Forget this guy." I think he might have gotten this idea of self-concealment from John's Gospel, where Jesus scares away his fair-weather disciples by claiming that salvation only comes by eating his flesh and drinking his blood. Nietzsche wants readers who will think about what he is saying and not just follow him because he seems right now to fit into a political narrative that they are swept up in. He does not want slavish disciples, and he does not want to be co-opted, but people who will wrestle with him. That all being said, I shall now unveil the parable. In his third book, Human All Too Human, he writes, quote, "Today, as always, men fall into two groups, slaves and free men. Whoever does not have 2/3 of his day for himself is a slave, whatever he may be, a statesman, a businessman, an official, or a scholar." Unquote. Well then, for Nietzsche, slavery is not a political or economic category, but, for lack of a better word, a spiritual category. It is a state of being. The slavish man is slavish because he does not, and perhaps cannot, will very much that is unique to himself. He works another's land. For his attitudes are those of his society. Thus, he is a slave to the founder of that society and serves that founder's will and spiritual goal. The great religions are the most obvious example of this. Very few are strong enough to will themselves a goal and accompanying values, virtues, etc. If you ask an ordinary man what he thinks on this or that issue, he recites the same generic answers as his neighbors, or friends, or pastor, or the newspaper. He spends most of his time riding the will currents of others. He creates no will currents of his own. No one repeats what he, and only he, said. No one follows his orders or bows in awe and respect before the fruits of his peculiar mind. He is not an original. He is only a motley of copies. He is a gear, a grunt, a hand for hire, spiritually speaking. He is no master and commander. He is a slave, whether he cares about it or not. He is an instrument, or a subordinate will, to the hands of the visionaries, and it may very well be that a well-compensated slave in material terms makes a far more effective tool than a miserable one. Remember that the lowest caste of citizens in Plato's Republic were also the richest in material goods, as that was the ceiling of their desire. Plato's rulers, on the other hand, were Spartan communists, for they desired something higher than pathetic contentment. In Nietzsche's notebooks we find two very interesting passages. Quote, "The workers shall live one day as the bourgeois do now, but above them, distinguished by their freedom from wants, the highest caste, that is to say, poorer and simpler, but in possession of power." Unquote. Quote, "The individual, each according to his kind, should be so placed that he can achieve the highest that lies in his power." Unquote. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche proposes that in ancient times the morality of a given tribe or culture identified itself with goodness and ranked its own members in order of their embodiment of that goodness. Such a morality is self-affirming, but also thereby nationalistic and bellicose. They believe in themselves and in their power, but those peoples who were thereby conquered and devoured by greater nations may yet have their revenge. They can no longer affirm themselves consistently, seeing how they have proven inferior in strength. Instead, they disaffirm their conquerors. They refuse to judge their own culture as bad despite its failure. Thus, we have master morality, which loves itself and its own kind and simply ignores the rest, and we have slave morality, which hates itself and projects that self-hatred upon those it envies. So, if a so-called slave is someone who is consciously or unconsciously dedicated to someone else's purposes, then their morality would either simply be a copy of their master's morality, in the sense of a son mimicking his father or an apprentice mimicking his master, or it would become distinguished from the master's morality by its negative, resentful character. In fact, the slave's morality never truly departs from the master's morality, for if it were to depart and become its own thing, it would thereby become a new master morality, concerned with living up to its own values and forgetting about everyone else's. But genuine slave morality is necessarily derivative. It is a shadow cast by a master morality. And what it says is, I want to be like the master, but I cannot. And I cannot create a new set of values better suited to my nature in which I could rejoice. Therefore, I must conclude that those who have successfully become the kind of being I want to be, I must conclude that they have become so only through fraud, or that they are preventing me from becoming like them, that they are being unfair gatekeepers, that it is their fault, not mine. So, I shall subvert their ideal from below. I shall speak ill of it, and turn the mob against it, and make the masters question their own happiness and their right to happiness. And then, when the masters are deposed, I shall slip into their role and replace them, and the mob won't be any the wiser. Again, René Girard is brilliant here. It is not difference that causes conflict, but similarity. One person wants what another person has, or both want what they think the other person has. Triumph, power, success in life are therefore divorced from the concept of good and remarried to the concept of bad, which is now called evil, and embodied in the conquerors, while the virtues necessary to survive slavery become good in themselves. Consequently, earthly success is looked at with suspicion, while weakness and submissiveness and failure are rewarded with fancies of heavenly reparations. The feedback loop of natural selection is thus frustrated, since pain and illness no longer register as reproofs, and natural rewards are avoided like the plague. Put facetiously, slave morality is sore losing. The loser sanctifies his losing post hoc by saying, winning at this game is actually losing, so by my losing, I'm the real winner. Lack of skill, lack of power, thus becomes desirable. It is a revaluing of values. Now, Christianity, as Nietzsche seems to understand it as a zeitgeist, and really less as a religion, employs pity for the failed and downtrodden in order to stir up resentment for the successful and the well-endowed. One is pressured to apologize for doing well, for instance. One is obliged to acknowledge that doing well in this life means one is favored not by God, but by the devil of Mammon, the god of this world. Such a discouraging attitude threatens the growth and fruiting of beautiful, successful, healthy human beings. It throws the baby out with the bathwater, the plant out with the pot. Either everyone succeeds equally, or nobody should succeed at all. Under the banner of equality, Nietzsche believed countless geniuses and potentially tall trees had been cut down before their prime. The end goal is not the cultivation of the Superman here, but the sabotage of this project, the undermining of all great things that rise above mediocrity. Never forget that Michelangelo was almost lost to despair under the preaching of Savonarola. One of the more peculiar doctrines of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints handed down by Joseph Smith, is the belief that heaven is divided into 3 kingdoms, which stand in a hierarchy. This idea can be found elsewhere. In Catholicism, for instance, you can argue, particularly in Dante's Inferno, you have hell and then purgatory and then heaven. So I'm not claiming complete uniqueness here, but it is very much emphasized in a way that I don't find anywhere else. The lowest kingdom in this scheme, the kingdom of the least glory, is called the telestial kingdom, and it is compared with the light of the stars. Above this kingdom is the terrestrial kingdom, compared to the light of the moon. Finally, there is the celestial kingdom, compared to the glory and light of the sun. One's right to a kingdom of glory depends upon one's obedience to the law of that kingdom. Fulfillment of a higher law means one attains to a higher glory, and fulfillment of a law requires one become and be the kind of being who can abide by that law and have joy in it. In my own opinion, this is connected with the idea of physical, literal resurrection. Your life is written into your body, into its reflexes and unconscious attitudes. The kind of being you choose to be in life becomes who you are eternally. Interestingly, what seems to distinguish the law of the celestial kingdom from that of the lower kingdoms is not a greater number of written commandments, but rather the attainment through complete submission and sacrifice to a unification with Christ. Abraham did not attain his glory by keeping a longer list of commandments, but ultimately by keeping one commandment, for which he was prepared by keeping the others, but which in fact contradicted all of them, the command to sacrifice Isaac. For what was tested in Abraham was not his Pharisaic prowess, but his absolute devotion to God, a devotion which transcended obedience to the letter of the law and followed instead the living word. Abraham journeyed with God into mountain heights where no one else can see what is going on, and if they could see, they could not possibly understand it. And for his obedience, for his willingness to make a Christ-like sacrifice, Abraham was made the father, the king of many nations. A quiet moment on a mountaintop that no one else saw was the scene of a true king's coronation. As Nietzsche suggests in Thus Spake Zarathustra, it is the quietest, mildest seeming events that are the true keys and pivots of history, the true springs of true power. Now, a remarkable point of this doctrine is its universalist bent. That is to say, with very, 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 very few exceptions, everyone shall inherit a kingdom of glory. In other words, everyone will enter heaven. This point has been re-emphasized by the highest authorities in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Dallin Oaks, for instance, said just last year that, quote, all the children of God, with exceptions too limited to consider here, will ultimately inherit one of 3 kingdoms of glory, even the least of which surpasses all understanding. There is a famous idea attributed to Joseph Smith that if people could see what the telestial kingdom is actually like, that is, the lowest kingdom of glory, they would kill themselves just to get there. Why? Well, because most people are after rest and contentment. They don't want anything else. They don't want responsibility, the responsibility of great power or of rulership, say of fatherhood or motherhood. They are happy to leave that to much more qualified people than they consider themselves to be. The question is not, therefore, how much hell can you avoid, but rather how much heaven you can attain. How high do you want to go? How much happiness and joy can you bear? For the highest joys require the highest sacrifices and the weightiest responsibilities. One must climb the highest mountains to see the greatest vistas. Are the people of the plains condemned for their contentment? Where do I differ with Nietzsche? I am continually puzzled by this question, and I think this is because to say where I differ with Nietzsche implies that Nietzsche is not a being, not a person, but simply a set of doctrines or propositions to which I might subscribe or unsubscribe. But that is just not how I experience Nietzsche. Nietzsche for me is a person. He wrote a great deal down, but he wrote it, to speak metaphorically, in his own blood. When you read Nietzsche, you are speaking with someone. He draws you into a kind of dialogue with himself. You may not even realize that's what's happening. Sometimes I have wondered if there are only two philosophers, two mountain peaks, namely Nietzsche and Plato, the two great dialoguers. There's a beautiful quotation from Nietzsche about Plato. I wasn't able to find it in time for making this script, but I'll try to track it down. It's in his notebooks, where he says that all of Plato's doctrines could be false, and yet it would not matter because the man behind them is so beautiful. So, these introductory lectures are less me telling you the propositions that Nietzsche subscribes to or does not subscribe to, and more me relating what I have learned from walking and talking with him, so to speak. Like anyone, if you were to ask him about something he wrote or seemed to say, if you asked the living Nietzsche, his answers would differ depending on the context, his mood, what he had discovered or been reminded of in his readings that day, and so on. And yet, the soul of Nietzsche would underlie his answers, even if the content seemed contradictory with some other part of his philosophy. It is not ecce verba, behold the words, but ecce homo, behold the man.